Hello guys, welcome back to the channel, and we're going to do something a little bit different today, see how it goes. I'm colouring in my Reptiloids book. I'll put the details of things I show down below. This is the page I've selected, and I'm going to use the Arteza pencils. When I'm colouring a page, obviously I pick my colours before I start. And the way I do this is usually by, deciding whether I'm going to colour things in real life so that they match the colours they should be, or if not. In this case, I'm going to stick true to colour. So obviously that means picking everything on the page and deciding what colour things must be. So my woodwork will be browns. There's leaves in the bottom that will be green, stones that will be grey. The building will be grey and black. I'm thinking it's going to be a night scene because it'll be a bit spookier, which will add dark blues and black, probably a bit of yellow for the moon, maybe some cream. It's all very neutral colours so far, and obviously they're kind of not really choices of colour, they're just the colour those things would naturally have to be, and that decides most of my colour palette for me before I start. Then you've got a few choices you can make that need to go with those colours. So things like the clock he's holding, his clothes, and the lizard himself. He's obviously a caricature and not a realistic lizard man holding a clock in a cape. So we've got a bit more freedom of choice with those colours. I'm just picking out highlighted areas with my palest shade. In the Arteza I'm using shade A138, which is earth red. I will also put my colours below, just in case anyone's interested, I suppose. I'm just picking out highlighted areas. Because it's my palest shade I'm starting with, it doesn't matter as much at this stage where you place, because your other colours will easily go over the top. They're the bits where things start to become a bit more important with colour placement. Obviously it depends on the kind of page and the kind of colouring and the kind of pencils and the kind of paper that you're using for how you colour. This is a simple caricature drawing on Amazon paper with wax-based pencils, so I'm not layering the way that I would with oil. It will be a much faster page. Anyway, so the colours left to choose. I've decided his clothes will be purple for my final colour. And I'm going to use some green anyway, just to match out my page. I'm going to make him green as well. We're popping the next tone into this woodwork now. Still a light tone, brown, but in a different, well, should I say a light shade of brown, but in a different tone. This one is A039, which is raw sienna, and I'm now just adding that. Hope my camera's not shaking. I don't know if this table moves when I colour or not. So we're adding that now to the other layer. Again, just a pale shade of brown for our first layer, which we can add more to later. Just starting to get the tones and colours that we want to have down. Bear with me if I go quiet. Sometimes you're just concentrating on the placement, and I'm quite new to this, so getting used to doing both things at once. It's quite difficult to remember not to lean in or move the page. Just realised as well, I need to hold my pencil a bit further down, don't I, so you can see a bit better. So we keep on with adding those layers. And you can start to see that first brown tone take shape. These are not too expensive a pencil. I think this is the 120 set of Arteza Experts. I think they're generally about £60 on Amazon. And they work quite nice on this paper. You will find different papers work in different ways with different pencils, and sometimes you'll use a pencil that you love and you won't like it, and it can be the paper that it doesn't like, doesn't lay down with the same. So I was trying to keep them and use them again later in a different way, see if I like them more. And I've generally found that most pencils you can find something that works well with them. Except for the Staedtler. I had my first ever set of pencils I don't have anymore. I got the Staedtler pack. I think just their plain pencils from Amazon, and I just had to press so hard to get colour that it used to make my arm ache too much. So they're the only set that I've had to give up on so far and give away. But everything else I usually rotate round to using at some point. I think this table does wobble, doesn't it? To just do our best and see. So there's a few roots down here in the bottom. I'm just going to add a couple of the tones into. Got one almost reddish brown and one much more yellowish brown. Just tend to do that because, well, in life, when you start checking out the different things you're colouring, wood isn't all one tone, all one colour, and it's just a quick way to create the illusion that there's different tones to the wood, and you just want to slot back and forth with your two paler brown tones. Now obviously I'm not an expert. I colour for the enjoyment of it. I colour because it's a hobby that I've found that I really enjoy, and it is just a hobby for me. It's not something I do professionally or have ever studied, and because of that we just colour the way that we like to colour. Well, everybody colours differently, and for me sometimes I'll start light, sometimes dark. It depends on the page and what I'm doing, and sometimes just what I feel like, to be honest. So there's never really a set plan. You just start somewhere on your page, or you never will, and you start to, in this case, add the shadows in last. So I already have light browns down just to give my bark some colour, and I'm now going to start to add shadows. So I'm picking out objects that are behind other objects and giving them a slightly cast shadow, and then I'm picking out parts of the bark that would be underneath. For me, I think my light source is obviously the moon coming out from the middle. So your light source would be this way and this way rather than one spot. So all my darkness is around the outside of the bark. And of course, a lot of illustrators will shade colour into your page for you to suggest darkness. That's what a lot of them do with these little lines, so you know to add some darker shading in those spots anyway. I'm just following the curve of the patterns that they've created, just to bring some texture and depth. For my shadowing, you know, obviously you can use a black or a grey. I tend to just use a very dark version of the same colour. So mine is espresso brown A071, and it's just a very dark brown. And we're just working our way through where we think the shadows would be, and therefore the naturally darker areas of wood, obviously in here. Just added a little bit of the lighter colour in the middle, because your shadows are never absolute. Gives a bit of colour depth to my picture. Do the same this side. My darkest colour is around the edge, where the walls of the bark are casting the shadow, and then just a little bit of the brown highlight in the middle, and we just darken it up a little bit so you get the brown but without the lightness of that brown. Same in all the recesses. Stops anywhere looking like a flat colour. Obviously it really does depend on the kind of way you like to colour, for how much detail you prefer to add in these cases. Everybody's page is their own, and they're all beautiful in their own way. It doesn't have to be shaded even, you know. People draw these pages in with markers and black colour them, and all the pictures look nice in their own right. They're just different. So you can start to see now with the darker tone, you're adding the illusion of the wood not being flat, having shaded, curved areas where it has some depth to it and makes it start to look 3D on the page. And obviously, so far we've very simply done this by following the clues left to us by the artists themselves and just deciding what would be behind other things and underneath the light source. I'm sure you've noticed by now that I'm also one of these colourists that jumps about all over the place. Like I haven't really must start to work my way along instead of just picking a spot and another spot. I think we'll make this a little patch behind the rest as well. And yeah, so I haven't put as much darkness along this front edge because that's where I've decided my light is, and a lot of the back of my tree is much darker. Now just going to start to add a lighter layer next to the darker layer of brown, just almost feathering a softer edge so that it will blend into my other colour a little bit easier, so you don't end up with a stripe look to it. It just creates a softer gradient between the colours. So just very lightly adding a bit more of the brown next to. Now obviously some people, they create amazing works of art from these colouring pages that are very realistic. They study photos and the real life look of the tree and make them look exactly as they should. But for me, I just want it to look interesting and have some depth and tone, and that's enough. So obviously it's not a professional grade page, but as you can see, anyone can make a simple page look quite interesting with a little bit of effort. So I'm going to come back in with the raw sienna, and I'm now just going to run that along that brown edge. So I'm again just starting to blend and merge these browns together now. I'm preserving lighter spots of that original layer of wood, but now just starting to build up into those darker areas. Now of course the way you've chosen to create your page will make a difference to the way you colour. Obviously there's light source, what kind of light, but also you need to take into consideration the fact that I said earlier I think this is going to be a night scene, so obviously your colours on the page will all be darker because it's not the daytime. There'll be more shadow, more darker tones, and your light will be focused more along where the moon will shine, rather than looking as it would in the daytime, which would look a lot lighter. So we're going to add a lot more of the darker brown in as we go. Right, well, in an earlier video I showed my pencils and said that I would, you know, colour different pages with my different coloured pencil sets. So I'm going back to the earth red. Add some of the redder tone in now. Again, I'm avoiding this inside edge. I want to leave that paler for now, till we really decide what we want to do with it. That of course means inside edge of any of these parts of the tree. Where was it? Oh yeah, so obviously the whole point of these videos is to show you some of the pencils and the kind of pictures they create. Going back to the darker brown now, just to go over some of these top thinner branches. Just because a lot of people seem to enjoy seeing the supplies used and people's opinions on them, and it's nice if you're wanting to buy a pencil to actually be able to see if it lays the way that you like, if it's the kind of pencil that you'd prefer, you know, if it matches the way you colour and will give you some of the tones that you want it to have. And of course, you know, different pencils require different techniques and take more time to use, which we don't all have. So you won't get a lot of layers on these pages. A little bit to do with, obviously it is a wax pencil and you will only get a few layers out of these. The other thing is the paper is the Amazon paper, so. And of course finally, sometimes you can't blame the pencil or the paper. As you can see, I am not slowly building up colour. Kind of speeding through the colouring a little bit, well, for the video, so that you can see a bit more than just me spending about 30 minutes in a corner of a tree. So because I'm putting more pressure on and being a bit quicker, I'll get less layers and a bit less detail than I would. But on the plus side, because it is a wax pencil, you'll get a nicer, quicker blend than you would with an oil. So because I know the moon is here, we're going to add a bit of yellow in. Always seems a bit strange, I know, but on these last bits of lighter tone that I've left, we're going to add the illusion of the moonlight. You could use a cream, but I think I'm going to use a yellow. So I've got the lemon yellow here, the A004. I'm terrible for not using the swatch charts that I painstakingly created. And because of that, you'll notice I always go a little bit lighter. Just at first, just to check, because there's nothing worse than putting a bit of pressure on and then realising, yeah, that yellow's way too dark and isn't going to give the look that you want. And you can always build up, but it's a lot more difficult to take away again. So just a lighter layer of a nice bright yellow along the edges, just to give the illusion of light bouncing off. Just blending it into that brown a little. Again, because, you know, it is night time, it's moonlight, I'm not going to add a lot of highlight. And I'm not making it too pale. And now that I know I like this yellow, just building it up a little bit. And there we have just a nice light edge that once we add a light source in, will start to make a bit more sense. So I'm just going to add a bit more darkness into these bottom edges, because there wouldn't be a lot of light in here, and these branches are underneath everything and behind. And like I said, as you go along, you're going to keep looking at it and thinking, oh, that needs to be a bit darker, and adding bits on, and it's easy to do. A lot easier than having to try to strip layers away. So just work it up in stages for the bits and pieces that you want. And as long as you're happy with it, it's all that matters really. That's pretty much, we're getting there. Probably later on I'll want to add a little bit more darkness, but that tree is a good start. So I think we'll do the greenery in the bottom. Again, I've pre-selected some greens and we'll see which ones we want to use. I'm going to start this time with my dark colour. Don't know why I tend to prefer to do this with greenery. Again, it's preference, it's your colouring, it's down to you. This is A141 Jungle Green, and I'm just going to add some of the darker tones. Let's work out where these leaves are. Obviously, these are the other side of the light source and down in the bottom, so they're going to be quite dark. And it's up to you to decide which bits sometimes you think should be part of the picture. And then we're going to add some lighter tones. Lighter tones here because I can darken them up in a moment easily enough, but I can't lighten them. I'm going to pop a little bit of a very pale yellow green in the top. So we've got the very pale in the tops, down to a medium and then a darker green, which looks horrendous at the moment, but will look better in a moment. So the pale green I've used is lime green, A101, and the medium tone I've used is matcha green, A006. I'm going to go back to my darker tone now and add in on the outside of my light source some of the darker green. Now obviously you've got a lot of rules in realism, like this would be a rounded shape and reflected light and everything like that, but it's not what I'm going for. Just want it to look interesting to the eye. So we're just bringing some of the darker green up the leaf, back into that lighter green, and now just working layers up until they blend together. And again, because it is night time, I'm not going to leave very much of that lighter green by the time I'm done, especially on the outside edges. of these leaves. I know you can probably see very little with my hand in the way, but I'll get better as I go. Do give me pointers for these pages. So I'm going to do some of the stones. I've chosen a couple of greys for these. I've got, for my lightest grey, mushroom grey, A152, and my medium tone is concrete grey, A157, and the darkest is elephant grey, A035. Again, I'm going to start with my darkest tone, and I'm not bothered with any reflection. You're a dark night anyway, and you're on the other side of the trees, so these would be in shadow and cast a darker tone. I'm going to pop the dark grey along the bottom of everything and give it an edge. They start to look immediately like they have a side to them that is then away from the light. This is going to be darker because it's behind the other, directly casting shadow. And then the medium tone over the top, just darkening the initial grey, leaving a little patch to those pebbles in the top to make this a nice simple highlight. You can do this in a much more detailed way, make these look a lot more realistic, but for me here the aim is, again, just to add a nice simple 3D look. To add a extra element of realism, you could add a little bit of your yellow to some of these stones where they would sit in the light. For me, probably I'd go with the bigger stone, which is pretty much the only one for me that I think wouldn't be cast in the shadow of him and the trees. So I start with my light source so that I can add my other colours over the top of it and just leave the hint of that cast yellow, just be a bit gentler over the top of it so as not to just remove it all. But you just end up with an impression of the light underneath the grey tones that you pop above. Just need to blend that in some. Created a dark line there that I didn't want, so now we're just going to darken underneath it to fix it, and because of that bring the darker tone up a little and just correct that grey, and then a final layer in the paler grey again over that yellow. Leaves the yellow underneath, but in a way that you can see that yellow mixes with the grey and looks to have some light cast on it. So I'm just going to drop you down a little bit so you can actually see what we've just done. Bear with me, sorry. This tripod doesn't like to be moved like that. And you can see that's where we are so far. You've got your light source starting to come into play, the plant in the background and the stones. So again, just going to now add another layer of that lightest grey just to darken the highlight for my night scene so that it makes a bit more sense. You wouldn't be too pale in the night light. And by adding that darker edge, it just makes those pebbles look like they have depth and a bit more 3D than they sat on the page, but again in a very simplistic way. And you can see the difference between just adding your light coloured layers and then starting to increase your darker tones. I've watched a lot of colouring YouTube and made the same mistake everybody always makes by not having enough contrast in my colours. You should always have very dark and very light and not just all these slight mid-tones that don't give the depth that you need to create shadow, which will give the look of those trees actually being round objects that are sat on top of each other rather than just a flat drawing. So I think we might have time for just a little bit of what else shall we do? I might start with his hand. I'm not good with skin. Obviously this isn't skin, we're a reptile, so we're slightly different, but it's all pretty much the same. So we're going to see about him being green. I'm going to add a little bit of brown, so I think that will give some texture to him. I'm going to choose, my darkest green will be the jungle green, A141. Going to use my mid-tone, the matcha green, A006. And I've got a pale tone here for him later, but to be honest, with the way the light source is, his hand will be quite dark. So the fluorescent yellow A126 we may not actually use very much. And my brown tone, going to use the same raw sienna, A039. I think we'll pop the very pale tone down. Most of this will disappear as we go, but like any skin tone, you want to give, decide what your undertone will be and then give a very fine layer. Skin has, different shades and undertones and complexions, and the only realistic way that you'll portray that is by building up your colour layers. I normally do a bit paler than this and work my way up, but obviously that would be a bit boring for you to see. So I've just popped down a very light layer of that very pale green, and I'm going to take my mid-tone, the matcha green, excuse me, and we're going to start just toning in some of the shadowed areas. Again, this author has very kindly suggested where his shadow and his knuckles are, and it gives you a nice easy guide to start to follow the shapes of the hand, and of course the creases of the knuckles would give a darker shade, and the backs of the fingers a darker tone, and his final finger underneath everything else would be very dark. He's not in a light source, so I'm not working on a highlight, only working on the lighter parts of his fingers. So we're now starting to differentiate between the finger parts that are in the shadows and the skin that sits on top. So also the thumb. Try and get my hand out of the way. Again, this changes because his thumb's upwards. The shadowing is in towards the bottom of the thumb. And for me, I'm going to pop a little bit underneath. And with any round object, you'd have a little bit on both sides. Just as the object starts to curl back round on itself, out of the light. So again, it's all just a suggestion of colour until we build up and up. I'm now going in with my darkest tone, and we're going to start to darken those depths of colour. Now obviously if this was a more realistic picture and it wasn't just a caricature, we'd be looking up how to colour lizard scales, but because of the picture type, I've chosen to just give him the colour that he'd have, but tone him more like he's just a skin tone. So this is my version of a lizard person, I think, because we're not going to end up with reptile scales, just a green skin tone. And we're just bringing those darker green over the other green now, but a little bit less. So I'm not extending quite as far. And we're now really starting to add shadow. Tiny little bit of that darker green, just pressing quite lightly now along that top edge. There we go. So we're going to go back to the mid-tone, the matcha green, and I'm now going to feather inwards from that darker green and remove the harsh lines from earlier. And we're leaving a little highlight, but we're now starting to build up more of the green that he would be made up from as we go along. And as you can see, these pictures are made up, it's all just green, but you've got your very different tones of green all added and blended together that create that more interesting depth of skin than you would get if you just use one pencil and press kind of, you know, light and dark and give it the idea of shade. We're adding different tones to create the different shades here. We're just working it up and up, nice and gently, and just reducing that highlight right down. Until he's nice and green is what we're aiming for. I'm going to add a little bit of that very pale green we used at first, because like I said, I don't really want him too pale anywhere, so we're not leaving a pale highlight in the middle, and we're using our lightest tone like you would a blender pencil. So this is the lime green, and we're now going over that initial green layer, little circles back and forth, and just deepening up and blending all this colour just to get rid of any harsh edges, and we start to look a bit smoother now. Work our way along. There we go. And again. On that bottom layer. And I think we'll add a bit of the darkest green again. I've just lost. Sometimes you add in that pale tone, you lose some of your darkness. You just need to add that back in again over the top while you still can. Obviously this paper will only accept so many layers, so you just got to do what it can. And we have his hand. So with my brown, I just want to add a little bit to the skin, just in a couple of areas, just to give that suggestion of another colour, and almost just fooling the eye a little bit that he's made up of a bit more than just the green. As a lizard would be, and I'm using it to darken some of the green while adding some brown. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. I think that looks okay though. I think we're going to have some really nice dark nails added onto that after. So hope you enjoyed that. I'll try and work on the guy in the middle for part 2 if you're interested. I think we'll leave that there for now. I know we didn't do a whole lot, but I'm not the fastest colourer in the world. If you enjoyed the video, please like it so I know that you like this kind of content and you find this useful. Subscribe if you enjoy the channel, and I will hopefully see you very soon.